Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. We're joined today by our old friend Greg Smith. Greg, welcome back to the show. We're happy to have you.
Hey, glad to be back, man. It's been too long. I always like being back with you guys. Get back to my Nebraska roots, even though I never left the state.
Yeah, it's been an interesting, kind of a down month for us and a down couple weeks, but coming off of the obviously the end of the season, signing day, transfer portal, and then we had the both those bowl games. Hope you've had a bit of a chance to relax, kind of slow down a little bit after the busy season, kind of coming out of I guess the season. Kind of what is your biggest takeaway in terms of just roster building, acquisitions, just like overlooking the state of college football these last few months and these chaotic last few months? What's been your biggest takeaway?
Man, keep your head on a swivel. It's always changing and evolving. Like things are always happening, which is why, like you said, we are at this point we're all hoping to get a little bit of a break as we go along here because there's just always something going on, and I think that is reflected in kind of how teams are approaching it too, right? So as you get towards like this kind of 105 number that people have been talking so much about, or even kind of whittling it down from there, as Matt Rule has talked about. He talked about the was it 57 man, 51 man roster that he talked about, and really focusing on those guys. You've got changes when it comes to Nebraska has kind of been out front on this too about spring football and whether or not we're going to start to slowly see spring games go away, if teams are going to do more OTAs. Like all of this stuff is kind of like linked in a way, and it all kind of goes back to the portal and roster acquisition, general managers, and all of the stuff that's been happening. Think about what's going on in college football with general managers getting paid and getting poached. That situation, and it kind of the big one was obviously, Chad Bowden leaving Notre Dame to go to USC, and then has basically taken the who's who of behind the scenes talent with him. And you've already seen, though, related to Nebraska, you've already seen them build out their behind the scenes roster as well, as far as, kind of their recruiting and scouting staff. And so those sorts of things are something that we continue to monitor and has been kind of, I think, dominant storylines throughout this offseason so far.
Right. And we've kind of touched on how important some of those behind the scenes guys are. And I feel like right now in the country, no one's doing or no one has their hand and finger on the pulse on like everything like Keith Williams does for Nebraska
Yeah.
right now. Like that's a
Mhm.
guy that, I mean, you talk to other programs and you kind of see how their general managers operate and how their director of player personnel operate. I don't know how many are as directly involved in as many recruitments as Williams is.
Right, yeah, he is. And it's funny because the way that kind of started out, it felt like he was like helping out on the offensive line. And then all of us, like so many of those guys liked him that they just continued to spread out his role and like kind of do that. And it's kind of happening kind of organically and naturally. And you're right though, like you don't see as that many people around the country, and at least in the Big Ten where I'm most familiar, that are kind of doing stuff like that. I think that having him as another kind of central point person and a guy that recruits really get along with, I think it's kind of a friendly face. You get on campus and you see him, you're like, okay, I feel comfortable, I feel at home. And then you kind of filter to the head coach and the position coaches from there and then the other players. I think he's a great kind of first point of contact and all of that. And that's a name that we'll continue to hear. And it wouldn't surprise me like after next year, you're talking about, oh, Keith Williams got a huge salary raise and an additional title to his name because he's an integral part of what they're doing.
For sure. And he's a guy that, Nebraska would like to hold on. And obviously the fact that he played in Nebraska gives them that inside track, but guy that I think is going to become very, very popular here in coach in at least behind the scenes personnel circles here in the next few months. Kind of looking at this, Greg, obviously Midwest analyst, we wanted to have you on, kind of touch on some top targets. The big news over the last couple of days has been the new top five for Trey Taylor,
Mhm.
the elite 2027 quarterback out of Illinois. Nebraska's in that mix. And talking off camera, you feel good about where Nebraska stands right now.
Yeah, I love Nebraska's position with Trey Taylor right now. Now, the caveat is that we're talking about a 2027 quarterback, even as accelerated as this process has been. And remember that his process can be this accelerated where he's 2027 and dropping a top five because he's seen all of these schools multiple times, right? Like he's a kid that every single week it feels like he's out there on a visit. So he is well informed about all of those schools. And so Nebraska, though, is a unique school for him in that he's very close. He's close enough to Nebraska to where it doesn't feel like it's too far, but he's far enough away to where it feels like he's getting away from home a little bit. I know that he really likes Dana Holgorsen and kind of his history of quarterbacks and offense development. And he also likes the school in general. Nebraska, the school, the business college is something that he's talked about with me numerous times about how much he liked that and how impressed he was with that because he does, foresee himself getting a business degree. I think that Nebraska was a school when he came out for that game day visit this past season was one that was kind of on his radar, but really blew him away on that visit with with the coaching staff, the stuff with the campus, and the fan support. I think Nebraska is right there in the mix with the other schools that are kind of in this. When you talk about, LSU, Texas A&M, and Michigan, it's kind of obvious why those schools are in it. But then you have Illinois, the in-state school that has been just killing it on the recruiting trail this year. And Brett Bielema will be the first one to let you know. If you've been following him on Twitter, he has been feeling good about himself, his team, and the future of that program. So they're not to be discounted. But I love the position Nebraska is in right now for an elite quarterback that really could be five-star by the time it's all said and done.
For sure. And he's a guy that, you look at Nebraska's kind of efforts in recent months, they've really started to focus in on Chicago and Illinois. And that's also kind of come at the same time as, like you mentioned, Illinois' recruiting rise. Like, another guy that is a top Nebraska guy or top Nebraska target here in 2026, Keenan Harris. Illinois kind of jumped Nebraska in that race and kind of feels like they came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think that one of the thing that Illinois is doing such a good job of doing, and they were one of those teams that we were talking about them losing some of their personnel guys. They lost Dre Brown, their like rock star behind the scenes to USC. So we'll see kind of the impact of that and how that carries over moving forward. But one of the things that Illinois has done a great job of, and this makes sense if you think about it, is that defensive recruiting in particular, those defensive recruits have really taken notice of the tradition that Illinois has had tradition in putting NFL guys or putting guys into the NFL at defense. And Brett Bielema, two things about his team. They're going to have good offensive lines and they're going to play good defense, right? And so you feel like you're going to be developed as a defensive player there. And again, that in the Keenan Harris's situation, that one is a pretty close to home situation as well. So I think they're kind of battling Missouri, and we'll see if other teams kind of get involved there. I'd keep an eye on Florida State, who's obviously very familiar to Nebraska fans with the defensive staff that they now have. But Nebraska still work to do there with Keenan Harris, but they're still in that because they're trying to really build that pipeline into Missouri, and they've done a nice job recently. They just got to keep that going.
For sure. With these 26 guys, just in general, for you as you're looking at it, you hear guys talk about lining up official visits this early, like, for June and we're in Feb. Obviously, you can't
Yeah.
put too much stock into official visit dates at this point. But what's most important for you for a prospect? Is it guys that are getting those official visits scheduled, or is it the guys that are making those second or third unofficial visits before setting up those visits? Like at this point, kind of what's more important in the process?
Man, that's an interesting question because I could see both ways. I honestly, with the way that this cycle has gone, I honestly think it might be these early setup official visits. It does, you're right. It does feel a little bit odd that so many guys have official visits set up. Like I was just thinking like yesterday, I need to set up a spreadsheet and list out all the guys that have already set up official visits because it's crazy right now. I feel like we're ahead of schedule when it comes to that, which probably tells you that guys are going to be, when we get to like around what would be spring game time and then into those official visits in early June, guys are gonna be coming off the board left and right. Like between, kind of May and July 4th, we're going to see a ton of commitments just based on how many guys you're seeing set up these official visits already for that time frame. Like it's kind of wild, like how accelerated this cycle has become. But then on the flip side, that also means to me that you're going to see guys make early decisions. We're going to get into the season. They're going to go, I don't know about this situation for one reason or another. And we're going to see a lot of flips at the end of the cycle. I think that that's just kind of the natural state of how those things go.
Yeah, I feel like the process is just getting accelerated like faster and faster. It feels
Hmm.
like, by the year. So yeah, we're at that point too where like, Nebraska's trying to get guys in town for the spring or the spring practices in March and April and then turn around and get those guys back for official visits. But for some of these guys, it's like, hey, we're not taking visits until May or
Right. They're
June. We're
already
not
setting up.
we're
They're skipping straight to the officials, which I do wonder then from the team perspective, I wonder if that then becomes you start working ahead on those guys that you're trying to get in for spring practice visits. So are you going to see, say, more regional 2027s that come in for Nebraska spring practices to then get a jump start? Like I'd be curious to see if they then make that quick adjustment, because you're right. A lot of guys are just skipping straight to the official visits in that later period.
For sure. But you also hear, talking to recruits, coming out of Nebraska's junior day and guys that are interested in Nebraska want to see the coaching staff in action. And Nebraska's just kind of hard pressed for time right now. The only opportunity they have to do that is these spring practices. You can't really expect to wait to get a guy, on an official visit or a visit in the season, in the 2026 cycle at least, because more than likely than not, they're going to be decided by the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you just can't wait around for that. And then in a lot of ways, though, it's good to have like we've talked about this before. If Nebraska can go into the season with like a double-digit commitments, then you end up in a really good spot. And I do think that that's kind of where this is trending, just based on how many of these kids are setting these early official visits. Even when we talk about, going back to the 2027 kid with Trey Taylor, like he's talking about a June 6th commitment date, right? And so when you're talking about that, you need to go ahead and get this stuff set up early. Can't obviously have the official with a 2027 kid, but that means that he'll actually be taking spring visits when it comes to these practices to see the coaches in action, like you mentioned.
Yeah, so I would say early on, I mean, not officially yet, but expect him in Nebraska. Should
Yeah,
expect him in Nebraska
I
here in
would
the next
expect
couple of
him in
months.
Nebraska for at least one spring practice, if not two, to go ahead and really see this staff in action. And that's good. You're going to want, if you're Nebraska in this situation with some of the changes that they've made on that coaching staff, as a quarterback, even though you made the move with offensive coordinator, seeing the wide receivers coach and being able to see how that's coming along will be a big deal, because he's a kid that is keenly aware of the talent that will be put around him, as most quarterbacks that are big time are. So yeah, that will be a good thing to get him on campus at least once during the spring period.
For sure. Talking about the state of Illinois, it's a state that, and specifically Chicago, is coming to focus for Nebraska, specifically along both lines of scrimmage. You look at the offensive line, Claude and Puma, a fast rising offensive tackle target, a fast rising offensive tackle in general, but is also fast rising on Nebraska's board. Just made his second visit for Nebraska's junior day here at the top of February. Last visited for the win over Wisconsin. That's a recruitment that's exploding right now, and that's a
Yeah.
recruitment that it's going to, probably be contentious to the end. What's your read on that recruitment right now? And just like I've tried to communicate to people that this recruitment is as important, if not more, not as important as Jackson Cantwell's, just because of the type of
Mhm.
ceiling. Kind of what is the
Yeah.
ceiling for a kid like Claude and Puma?
I've loved him ever since I saw him in person last year. I'll never forget it because he is now since transferred out of the school that he was at, and you can tell sometimes that can be a potential to happen because I went to the school and like he just stands out. Like he's just so much bigger than everyone else. He was at a Chicago public league school before Phillips, that was right there in Hyde Park area, and you get there, he stands out so much, and he just moves differently than everyone else, and to be that size and have that level of footwork is just unique and special. Turns out, of course, he's a former like basketball player. He's got some soccer in the background, well, so that's why he's got the footwork that he does. He transfers to Mount Carmel High School, which is a powerhouse, and they've got just a ton of players on that team. And so you know that recruitment was about to blow up. And ever since then, it feels like it's been nonstop with offers. And so much so to the point to where I think that he's kind of wide open. Like I don't think that he's done getting offers because more eyeballs are going to come his way. But he's got basically every school kind of in the region that you would want as a player of that stature. Except maybe Ohio State has not offered at this point, but they're always a little bit weird when it comes to certain, especially
And
offensive
they're in an
line. And now
offensive line coaching
and
turnover too.
yeah, and that too. And they're in a weird situation. They've got to figure out what they've got to do with their Ohio offensive tackles because they're like a trio of four stars out there. They don't cry for them. They've got their own issues, right? But with him, like with Claude, like you could see him continue to pick up offers. I think that Nebraska did a really good job here of getting in early and kind of getting that relationship built from the start before like the big blow up happened. I think that Michigan will be another team kind of in the mix here, but I think Nebraska excuse me, is in a good spot for him, but I don't know if that is going to be one that's going to end anytime soon because I know that some of the people around him are kind of impressing upon him, hey, take your time, let's see how things kind of play out. And I think that's probably the right thing to do considering how the recruitment blew up and he's transferred schools and is probably about to take another step up even.
For sure, yeah, other side of the line, Mikhail Blade's a guy they finally got on campus. They've been working in that recruitment for a while. Four-star edge rusher out of Chicago as well.
Mhm.
That feels like one that's again, it feels like a Big Ten heavy recruitment.
Uh-huh.
Outside of Notre Dame involved as
Yeah.
well. But very Midwest focused, obviously, and then you've got USC, Oregon, and the West Coast Big Ten teams involved. Where do you see Nebraska in this recruitment? And yeah, again, what type of talent are we talking about with Mikhail Blade?
Yeah, I'll start with the talent. I think that he's a kid that he's the next one in that area, and this has been, I think, now 3 or 4 years running in Chicago, where they've had these pass rushers, these guys off the edge, going back to Marquise Lightfoot. Justin Scott played defensive tackle, but he was still kind of a terror in the interior pass rusher. Both of those guys ended up in Miami. Then you had, the kids this past year, led by Nathaniel Marshall, who ended up back at Michigan. And now Mikhail Blade is that next kid who will be challenging for, high 4-star, even 5-star potentially kind of territory by the end of his recruitment because he is just a dynamic player off of the edge and there's a reason why the schools that you just named, those are not chumps, right? Like those are all big time schools. And it always stands out to me when a kid has, say, like Nebraska, but then he's also got Michigan, but then USC and Oregon are also in the mix. That tells me that basically everyone, and Notre Dame, that basically everyone kind of likes this kid and he can go anywhere he wants to go, right? I think that some of the shuffling around with these schools is kind of something to watch with him too, right? So as you look at Michigan and kind of their, I guess, what's the nice way to say this? Renewed focus on NIL, right? After the Bryce Underwood situation, I think that that piques his interest. I think that USC, what they've done in kind of loading up their behind the scenes group, plus remember another Chicagoland kid, Braden Jones, 4-star defensive lineman, is also currently committed to USC. So that helps there. But when it comes to Nebraska, I think that they did a good job of being early on him as well. They were talking to him last year before, as he was kind of, I think, dealing with a little bit of injury and a transfer situation last year. And Nebraska did a really nice job of getting in with him. They've had him on campus a couple of times. I think that they're in a decent spot. I think that you're going to have to continue to work hard on that one, though. I think that that one is one that it's going to be hard to pull Mikhail Blade. But I think that at the same time, too, I didn't even mention them. Watch out for Notre Dame. I think that that's a team that I have future casted for them because of when I was out there this past year on that same trip that I saw Cloud and Palma. Notre Dame was all the talk and buzz around him. But like I said, some of these changes around college football, I think, have really impacted his recruitment. And I still think that he's early on here. And it wouldn't surprise me if Nebraska makes a top group coming up for him.
For sure. He's a guy that they feel well positioned to take an official visit, but it's so early to call it at this point in terms
Yeah.
of especially when guys don't have them set in stone just yet. But yeah, another one like that's coming to mind and a point of focus on the defensive line, especially with some targets and some shuffling along that group as Nebraska kind of replaces Terrence Knighton with Terry Braden, who's just getting into town and just getting settled after the Super Bowl. On that note, kind of just talking defensive targets, we talked a little bit about Keenan Harris. Elsewhere in Missouri, obviously a point of emphasis for Nebraska. Zephyr Walker, running back, obviously out of a familiar place, Ray Peck for
Yeah.
Nebraska. Got Jaden Doss out of there a couple of years ago, a place Nebraska likes to go to. That's a recruitment that's a little weird. You and I have talked about this
Yeah.
kind of off camera, like a guy that, is kind of just figuring out the recruiting process, it feels like,
Right.
still at this stage and plans to make official visits, already says Nebraska is going to get one, already has a date locked in for that, already says, and that's a date that it's early, but that's becoming the date for Nebraska. June 20th is going to be the date. Dayton Raiola is already planning to visit. Ryan Mosley, 4-star wide receiver. Jabari
Mhm.
Brady, 4-star wide receiver. I think that's like last year, June 21st was Nebraska's like big visit weekend. I think
Right.
June 20th is going to be this year's big visit weekend. But Walker's on that visit list. Again, what's your read here in the sense of do you feel like this is a recruitment that's still getting felt out, or do you feel like there's a couple favorites here?
I feel like it's still getting felt out, but at the same time, I could see somebody blowing him away on an official visit and then him just shutting things down, right? I think that I've talked to him about his desire to want to take as many official visits as possible and say even visit every school that's offered him. Like that's going to be really hard logistically to do. So then because of that, Nebraska already having a visit locked in and continuing to make sure that that visit happens and stays locked in, I think is a really big deal. And I do think that you characterize it correctly in saying that he's still kind of feeling out the process, which is interesting because he's been a kid that has been heavily recruited now for a couple of years. We've been talking about this kid now, what feels like for 2 or 3 years now, even back to when his freshman year was the year that Jaden Doss was a senior, right? And so I went out there and saw him and so to see Jaden Doss, and I always ask coaches this, like, hey, is there a kid coming up that you think I need to be on the lookout for? And he was the kid that Walker was the kid that their coach pointed out. And so I've been tracking him since then. He's a fantastic player. Like there's a reason why, these schools are really wanting to see get him on campus and have him take these official visits is because he's really kind of more of an all-purpose back that can run between the tackles. He's fast. He's got good speed, good balance, runs at a good pad level. But you can also put him in the slot and have him play some slot receiver. He catches the ball well out of the backfield. I was super impressed seeing him last summer line up kind of in the slot and 7-on-7 when I went out there for a tournament. And so he's a very good player. It's just that recruitment is a little bit weird. But like I said, I could see somebody getting him on campus for an official visit and him just getting totally blown away and feeling like, okay, this is the spot for me. And I think Nebraska is in position to be able to pull that off. It's just been kind of a unique recruitment so far. But I do think that he's a very important recruit for them because you're going to want to. I continue to think that Nebraska needs to be able to load up on running back because of the history of this program and to get where they want to go in the Big Ten. You're going to have to start getting continue to get some big time running backs. I should say start because I like the guys that they brought in this past class as well.
For sure. And Walker's one of those guys that feels like a true bell cow, like you mentioned, kind of that
Yeah.
has that ability to be a three down back, and really take that job. We talk about the guys that got this last cycle. Both those guys have some work to do to be an every down type back. Walker kind of steps on campus ready made to be your every down back. And hypothetically for Nebraska, Emma Johnson, you potentially lose him after this season. That's a guy that can step right up and kind of take over that starting job. So he's a priority, point of emphasis target for Nebraska here in 2026. Another one in the state of Missouri, again, if you're talking just pound for pound, most important targets on the board, Titan Davis. A recruitment that, again, for as probably big as it's going to be and how much we're going to be talking about Titan Davis in a couple of months, I don't think he gets talked about enough as a priority target. And I don't think his junior season gets talked about enough because there was
Right.
some truly dominant stuff on that junior tape.
Yeah, so this is the kid that it's so interesting because I'm glad I don't mean to sound redundant, but I did see him too, which I guess a good thing for my job because I've seen a lot of these kids that we're talking about is that that's what I kind of came away from seeing him in person. And they actually played Jamarian Parker's team. They're speaking of Nebraska running back commits. And while Jamarian Parker's team is a dominant team and they won that game, Titan Davis had some really great moments in that game. And I think that there are times to me where he looks Chase Young-esque. I don't want to say he's there yet, but that's the vibe that I get from him. I think he can be that type of player, and I think that he should be talked about more just in general nationally. And I think that he is definitely a kid that Nebraska should continue to focus on because while Missouri has a good kind of start in this recruitment, you just never know how those are going to go. And I think that if he's looking to do something different, or Missouri, if they fall off, Eli Drinkowitz, if they don't fall off, Eli Drinkowitz is always talked about for other jobs. Like you could use that as kind of a wedge as well. I think that kind of getting back into that region and that area, which is Nebraska has been doing, I think is another thing that they have going for them. Yeah, I think that Titan Davis should be as talked about as a prospect in that 2026 cycle as anybody, especially in the region for Nebraska coming up this cycle. I think that he's a super player and would be somebody that would look great in Husker Red.
For sure. But for a guy like Davis specifically, I take note. I don't think he made it back to Nebraska this past fall. But you always take notice when a guy spends multiple days on campus on his own dime. And last
Yeah.
spring, he spent 3 days on campus. We saw him after a Thursday practice. just hanging out around the facility, and he stayed through Saturday spring game. So he spent 3 days, 3, 4 days on campus last spring. And like I said, he's a guy that keeps things close to vest.
Yeah, for sure.
As far as we know, he didn't make it back to campus in the fall, but he might have snuck in, quietly
Right.
in between. But he's a guy that is a point of emphasis target for Nebraska, and like you mentioned, I think Missouri, specifically St. Louis, is such an important area for Nebraska. I think and when you look ahead to 2026, there's more of a national focus again with some of the new staffers. They're getting back into South Florida, they're getting out
Mhm.
to the West Coast, they're getting out to some areas. But I think the two most important regions for Nebraska this year, St. Louis and kind of attacking that area, and Chicago.
Yeah.
You talk about the most important targets. Feel like they're both at least in that area, or at least fly out of that area. Another, just before we get out of here, just another interesting Missouri target, or target out of the state of Missouri, Jacob Eberhardt, a guy that keeps
Okay.
another guy that's quiet, keeps
Yeah.
things close to vest, but has that quiet, buzzing recruitment that's like steadily building, has true SEC attention.
Hmm.
Nebraska's been in this one for a while. He's coached by Jeremy Macklin,
Yeah.
out at Kirkwood, and can play either side of the ball. Nebraska likes him at a couple different positions, could play him at receiver, could play him on the defensive side of the ball. Um, just talking about the talent specifically, obviously, this is a recruitment that I think it's too early to have a true feel on. I don't think there's a great read
Yeah, I don't
here.
think so either.
But kind of what is the talent here? Like what type of player are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think we're talking about another one of those kind of unique athletes that Nebraska really likes, and he's not quite. If I say jumbo, that's probably giving him too much size. Like 6'3", 210 pounds. I'm kind of a bigger athlete that Nebraska could use as a Swiss Army knife. Not necessarily like Michael Terry-esque from last cycle, but approaching that area where you can play him in a number of different roles. In Nebraska, and I think that that's going to ultimately decide kind of which schools kind of pull out ahead for him is where he sees himself playing in college. Does he see himself on the offensive side? Does he see him on defense? Does he really care? Does he just want to pick the place that gets him on the field the fastest, right? Like that sort of thing could end up being something that is a determining factor. But yeah, I think that he's another, every year where this is something to get used to under Matt Rule. We are always going to have a handful of these types of guys that we're talking about. What was the kid last year? Jeremiah Jones, another kid like this, where it's just a bigger athlete that you can play at multiple positions, and you'll just kind of figure it out later and see where the best fit is for him. Eberhard is that type of player.
Right, right, and another guy similar caliber. Just before we get out of here, I did want to touch on him just because he's got one of the more fun tapes I've watched. Nasir Rankin, four-star athlete out of Morgan Park in Chicago, just a super fun player.
Okay.
Recently announced his top schools. Nebraska's in the mix. Feels like Illinois is a school to beat. We talked about Brett Bielema trying to lock in some of the best in the state, and doing a really good job at it. Illinois is a favorite. Feels like it early on, but. Again, you went and saw Nasir Rankin kind of,
Yeah.
and I've been texting you about
You were. That
Nasir,
was a
kind of
great call.
watching him, and then getting to see some of the basketball stuff, like kind of put into perspective, kind of what type of player we're talking about here, because it's a 6'1" kid that is hooping.
Yeah, like he's if he was just a few inches taller, I think he's a D1 basketball kid. He's really a good basketball player, and that just shows you the athleticism that he has. It just so happens that he's 6'1", and unless you're like Chris Paul style good, you're just going to be hard for you to make it in basketball at 6'1", right? So luckily for these football coaches, he's also a dynamic slot player, right? And I think that when you look at kind of our new rankings and how we kind of came out with this slot position that we're doing moving forward with our rankings, he's the perfect embodiment of the type of player we wanted to capture in that, right? As he's a top 10 slot guy for us in 26. And seeing him, like he can go, like he can take the top off the defense, but he's also a pretty good route runner, could get better there, but pretty good route runner. But he's also dynamic on jet sweeps. His team used him in jet sweep motion as well. And it's really tough to stop that. If you think about it this way, the team that he was playing had Chris Bridges, who was a borderline 5-star, or Chris Burgess, borderline 5-star defensive offensive lineman who's now off to Notre Dame. And he could not do anything with Nasir Rankin. Like they just had no answer for him. They had some other guys too on that team. And so, yeah, he's a very dynamic player that I think Nebraska did a good job of getting in with. Like you said, though, Illinois is out ahead on this one. Another team to watch is Michigan here. I do like Illinois still, but I'm starting to question when you start to get on that, hey, Illinois has had their big run of commitments here lately. Why hasn't Nasir already jumped in that class? So the more time that goes by, the more I'm like, okay, other teams can still get in here and jostle for position.
Right. Yeah, he's a guy that again also feels like he's kind of figuring out this whole recruiting process.
Mhm.
And a guy that, I think Nebraska wants to address that offensive weapon, that slot, that like guy
Yeah.
that they can manufacture touches to. You have him, you have Cohen Brown down in Texas, both guys that can kind of do that kind of stuff that they see as these versatile offensive weapons. So yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, appreciate you, Greg, joining in on
Yeah.
on a bit of a Midwest focus. Obviously, this class is so Midwest heavy, so we'll have you back very soon, I'm sure. Once we
Good.
get closer to March and spring ball and get some of these visits ramping up again, but we'll definitely have you on. But appreciate you making the time for us, Greg. And before we get out of here, anything you want to plug?
Oh, no, no, that's interesting. I didn't really have anything I thought of the plug, but I am glad that Nebraska is getting more into the Midwest focus and having that be a thing. And I'll be happy to come back and talk more about the top guys that they're talking to.
For sure. And we'll have you back on very soon. Like we said, Greg, appreciate you joining, and we will be back with another episode next week.